It was a cold evening, and the golden lights from the restaurant spilled gently onto the wet pavement outside. Inside, the place was buzzing with chatter and the soft sound of piano music that drifted through the air like a calm breeze. The tables were filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, their laughter echoing off the polished walls. It was one of those places where the air itself felt expensive, where people spoke softly but looked around to see who might be watching. Among them was a young woman wearing a plain black uniform and a tired smile. She moved carefully between tables, balancing trays of wine glasses and steaming plates. Her hands were steady, though her fingers were slightly red from hours of work. Most people hardly noticed her as she passed by. To them, she was just another face in the background, someone to pour their water, clean their mess, and disappear quietly. At one corner table sat a group of well-dressed guests who seemed to think they owned the room. They laughed loudly, sipped on their drinks, and made sure everyone could hear their jokes. The waitress approached them with her notepad ready, keeping her tone polite and her eyes gentle. "Good evening," she said softly. "Would you like to start with something to drink?" One of the men glanced at her from behind his glass and smirked. "Well," he said, turning to his companions, "I guess we're being served by the youngest member of the orchestra tonight." The others laughed, not because the joke was funny, but because it came from him. The woman sitting next to him added, "Look at her hands. So delicate, but I doubt she's ever touched a piano key in her life." The waitress smiled faintly, pretending not to hear. She just nodded, took their order, and walked away quietly. But the laughter followed her for a few seconds before it blended back into the music. At the far end of the restaurant, an older man was playing the grand piano. His music filled the space, smooth and calm, like it had been part of the restaurant forever. Everyone loved his playing. He never smiled, but his music spoke for him. The waitress often paused near the piano for a brief moment when no one was watching, just to listen. Music had once been a big part of her life. It still lived quietly inside her, though no one knew. The night went on like every other, orders coming in, glasses clinking, and the low hum of conversation. The waitress stayed patient, polite, and invisible. But halfway through the evening, something unexpected happened. The music stopped suddenly. The pianist coughed a few times, pressed his chest, and stood up slowly. He gave a small nod to the manager, apologizing with his eyes. Then he quietly left, supported by one of the staff. The sudden silence felt strange. People looked around, whispering. Without the music, the restaurant lost part of its charm. The manager, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit, hurried across the room trying to calm everyone. "Please excuse the interruption," he said with a nervous smile. "Our pianist will be right back." But minutes passed and the piano stayed silent. The group of elite diners from before started whispering again, clearly amused by the situation. "Maybe the waitress can play something," one of them joked loudly. "She looks like she's dying to try." The waitress heard them. She was standing a few feet away, refilling a glass of water. She looked at the piano, then at the restless faces around the room. Something stirred inside her. A small, brave thought that had been sleeping for years. Before she could stop herself, she walked up to the manager. "Sir," she said quietly, "if it helps, I could play for a while, until he returns." The manager blinked, surprised. "You?" he said softly, as if he didn't hear right. She nodded. "Just for a few minutes," she said. "I know some pieces." He hesitated, glancing around the room. The guests were getting impatient, and he had nothing else to offer. "You're sure you can handle it?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I can." The manager sighed and stepped aside. "All right," he said, almost under his breath. "Let's give it a try." The group of fancy diners chuckled among themselves. "This should be entertaining," one man said, leaning back in his chair. "A waitress concert." The waitress ignored them. She walked toward the piano slowly, her heart beating faster with every step. The restaurant had grown unusually quiet, as if everyone was curious to see what she would do. She wiped her hands gently on her apron, took a small breath, and sat down on the piano bench. The smooth wood felt familiar beneath her fingers. For a moment she just sat there, her eyes closed, remembering a different time. The sound of her teacher's voice, the old music room, her father's proud smile when she played. It all came rushing back like a warm wave. Then, without saying a word, she placed her hands on the keys. The first few notes were soft, almost shy. But they carried emotion, real emotion, something raw that no one expected. The sound spread slowly through the room, reaching every corner like a whisper. Conversations faded. Forks stopped clinking against plates. Even the waiters paused where they stood. The melody grew stronger, smoother, more confident. Her fingers moved with grace like they had been waiting for this moment for years. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was honest. It told a story that words could never explain. The people at the fancy table stopped smiling. They stared, speechless, as the same woman they mocked moments ago filled the room with music that touched their hearts. Her playing was effortless yet filled with quiet power. The notes rose and fell like a tide, pulling everyone into her world. A man at the bar lowered his glass slowly. A couple in the corner held hands without realizing it. Even the manager standing near the entrance forgot about everything else and just listened. The waitress didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were closed, her face calm, her hands moving like they were part of the piano itself. The sound was pure, gentle, and full of soul. She wasn't just playing a song, she was telling her story. Every note carried a piece of her struggle, her silence, her hidden dreams. When the melody reached its highest point, it was as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. No one dared to move. The same people who had once seen her as just a worker were now seeing something completely different. Someone with depth, talent, and heart. As she played, she didn't think about her past or what people thought. She didn't think about the jokes, the long hours, or the pain of lost dreams. In that moment, she was free. The piano was her voice, and she let it speak for her. After several minutes, the last note lingered in the air before fading softly into silence. She sat still for a few seconds, her hands resting gently on the keys. The silence that followed was deep, not awkward, but full of awe. You could almost hear the sound of people breathing again. Then slowly the applause began. One person clapped, then another, and then the whole room joined in. It wasn't the loud, polite applause people give after a performance. It was real, the kind that comes from surprise, respect, and emotion. Some people stood up. Some smiled with wet eyes. The waitress bowed her head slightly, her face calm but her heart racing. The same group of guests who mocked her now sat quietly, ashamed. One of them murmured, "I had no idea." But the waitress didn't look their way. She simply got up from the bench, gave the piano one last glance, and walked back toward the kitchen like nothing special had happened. The manager followed her, still speechless. You never told me you could play like that," he said, almost whispering. She smiled softly. "It's just something I used to do," she replied, her voice simple, humble. The night continued, but something in the air had changed. The guests spoke quietly now, their tone softer. The laughter had faded, replaced by a quiet respect that filled the room. Later, when the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, the waitress stood near the piano once more. She touched the keys gently as if thanking them. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a waitress, but as herself. What she didn't know yet was that this small, brave moment would change her life in ways she could never imagine. The night after she played the piano, the restaurant felt different. The same golden lights glowed softly across the tables. The same scent of roasted coffee and warm bread drifted through the air, but something had changed. People whispered differently now. When the waitress walked past, a few guests looked up from their menus, not out of impatience, but out of quiet respect. Some even smiled at her, as if they were looking at someone they had just discovered. She wasn't used to that kind of attention. For a long time, she had been invisible, a quiet shadow moving from table to table, forgotten as soon as she walked away. Now eyes followed her, but not in a bad way. It made her nervous and unsure how to react. She simply kept doing her job, pretending that nothing was different. The manager stopped her in the hallway near the kitchen. He had a kind expression for the first time in months. "You really surprised everyone last night," he said. "I didn't even know you could play." She smiled politely and replied, "It's just something I learned a long time ago." He nodded slowly. "You did more than just play," he said. "You saved the evening. People are still talking about it. You should be proud. Thank you," she said softly. Then she went back to her work. Deep down, though, her heart felt strange, like something she had buried long ago was starting to wake up again. That evening, the same group of elite guests came again. They seemed more polite this time, quieter, as if they were trying to act differently after what had happened. The waitress noticed their change but didn't say anything. She simply served their table with her usual calmness. One of the women, the same one who had mocked her hands before, looked up and said, "Your playing was beautiful. Truly. I didn't know you had such talent." The waitress gave a small smile and nodded. "Thank you," she said, and moved on. But deep inside, a mix of emotions stirred. Not anger, not pride, just something quiet and deep. She had heard plenty of people talk down to her before, but this was the first time someone apologized without saying the word. Later that night, when her shift ended, she walked home through the quiet streets. Her small apartment was a 10-minute walk from the restaurant. She lived alone in a tiny room with pale walls and a single window overlooking the streetlights. On one side of the room stood an old upright piano. The wood was scratched and a few keys didn't work anymore, but she had kept it since her teenage years. It was the one thing she could never sell, no matter how difficult life became. She sat down in front of it, her fingers resting gently on the keys. For a moment she just stared, lost in thought. Then she began to play, not for anyone else this time, but for herself. The notes were soft, warm, and personal. As she played, memories began to return. Her father's voice, encouraging her to keep practicing, her teacher's gentle smile, the sound of clapping at her first small recital. It all came back like a dream that had been sleeping for years. Her eyes grew wet, but she didn't stop playing. She played until she forgot about the time, the bills, and the long shifts. When she finally looked up, the clock showed past midnight. The next day at work, something unexpected happened. The manager came to her again, holding a phone. "You won't believe this," he said. "Someone recorded your performance. It's all over social media. People are sharing it everywhere." She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He turned the screen toward her. A short video played, her sitting at the piano, her face calm, her fingers moving gracefully. The caption read, "The waitress who silenced the room." The clip had thousands of views already, and more were adding up every minute. The comments were full of praise, so much emotion in her playing. She doesn't need a stage. She is the stage. Never judge a person by their job. She stared at the screen in disbelief. She hadn't even known someone was recording. The thought made her blush with embarrassment, but also with a quiet sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. For the rest of the day, guests came in asking about her. Some even requested she play again. The manager smiled and said he would arrange something soon. She wasn't sure how to feel about all this sudden attention. It was strange. Yesterday she was invisible, and today everyone seemed to know her. That night, after closing time, the manager approached her again. "Would you like to play officially next weekend?" he asked. "We'll make it part of the dinner experience. Just a few songs each night. You'll get extra pay, of course." Her heart raced. I don't know," she said softly. "I haven't performed in years. I only played that night because there was no one else." He smiled kindly. "Sometimes life surprises us when we least expect it. You have a gift. You should use it." She thought for a moment, her eyes drifting toward the piano in the corner. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it." The news spread quickly. Regular customers talked about it all week. The restaurant even printed a small notice. "Live piano by our very own waitress." It was both exciting and frightening. When the weekend came, she stood near the piano again, this time without her apron. She wore a simple white blouse and a long black skirt. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down, but the moment she touched the keys, everything else faded away. She played with the same honesty she had that first night. Soft, emotional, and full of truth. People stopped eating again. They just listened. The restaurant wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was a stage, a moment frozen in time. After she finished, the applause was even louder than before. The manager looked proud, and guests lined up to thank her personally. Some asked if she had a music album. Others asked where she had studied. She answered politely but never exaggerated. "I used to study a long time ago," she said. Then life got busy. A man at the bar who happened to own a local recording studio approached her after the crowd thinned. "You have something rare," he said. "Real emotion in your music. If you ever want to record, come see me." He handed her a business card. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she replied softly, taking the card with shaking hands. That night, walking home again, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that whispers, maybe it's not too late. She looked up at the stars and smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She felt alive. But life, as she knew, had a way of testing that hope. Over the next few days, her old fears returned. What if people were only interested for a short time? What if she wasn't good enough to do this again? At work, she tried to stay focused. The restaurant became busier, with new guests coming in just to hear the waitress pianist. The pressure grew. She practiced at night after long shifts, sometimes until her fingers ached. One night as she was leaving, she overheard two co-workers talking. "She's lucky," one of them said. "If that video hadn't gone viral, no one would care. Everyone's acting like she's some kind of star." It stung a little, but she didn't let it show. She had learned that success often brings whispers. Instead of responding, she just smiled and went home. That night she sat by her old piano again. The room was dim, but the keys shone faintly in the moonlight. She thought about her father, how he had always told her, "The world will notice you when it's time." Maybe this was that time. She played softly until her hands stopped trembling. The notes filled the silence, carrying her hopes, her fears, and everything she had kept hidden. Somewhere out there, people were still sharing that video, still talking about the waitress who played from her heart. But for her, the real miracle wasn't fame. It was finding herself again. The next weekend, she returned to the piano at the restaurant, calm, confident, and ready. The same people who once saw her as invisible now waited quietly for her music. She didn't play to impress anyone. She played because it was who she was. And this time, when the applause filled the room, she smiled, not for the attention, but for the peace it brought inside her. What she didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, that her story was about to take another turn she could never have imagined. The following week felt like something out of a dream. The restaurant was full every night, and guests asked in advance which evenings the waitress would be playing. The manager was thrilled. He spoke proudly about her to anyone who would listen, telling the story of how she had saved the night with her music. But for her, it wasn't about fame or attention. Every time she sat at that piano, she felt like she was talking to an old friend she had lost long ago. It brought back pieces of her life that she had tucked away deep inside, memories she hadn't dared to visit in years. On one quiet afternoon before her shift, she stayed after lunch service to practice a new song. The restaurant was empty except for her and a few staff members cleaning up. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster, as she built a melody full of warmth and sadness. The cook stopped sweeping to listen. He leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. "That's beautiful," he said softly. "Did you make that up yourself?" She nodded. "Yes, I wrote it a long time ago. It's called Homecoming." He smiled. "Sounds like it comes from the heart." "It does," she said, and her voice carried a faint ache that made him stay quiet. That evening, while walking home, she passed by an old music store she hadn't noticed in years. The windows were dusty, but a small piano stood near the front, the same model she had practiced on as a teenager. Something about it made her stop. Through the glass, she could almost see her younger self sitting there, full of dreams and plans. When she was young, her world revolved around music. Her father had been a quiet man who worked long hours as a mechanic, but he had loved listening to her play. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, he would sit near the piano while she practiced. He would close his eyes and say, "One day, you'll play for the world." She still remembered those words clearly. Even after all these years, she had earned a scholarship to a respected music academy when she was 18. It had been the proudest day of her life, her father's eyes shining as he hugged her tight. But that happiness didn't last long. Just a few months after she started classes, her father fell ill. The bills piled up quickly, and she had to make a choice between staying at school or coming home to help. She chose her family. She always would. She worked at small jobs, waiting tables, cleaning, anything she could find. Her music slipped away slowly, piece by piece, until it became something she only did at night when no one could hear. After her father passed, she never went back to school. She had carried that quiet ache inside her ever since. Now, standing in front of the music store, she pressed her hand against the cold glass. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember it all. the lessons, the dreams, and the way her father used to smile when she played. That night, when she returned to her apartment, she lit a small candle and sat down at her old piano. The keys were uneven and a few stuck when she pressed them, but she didn't care. She played the song she had called Homecoming again, this time with tears streaming down her face. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was something deeper, like she was finally forgiving herself for letting go of her dreams. The next few days passed quickly. Her video kept spreading online. People from different cities were talking about her story. A waitress who had once been invisible, now touching lives with her music. One afternoon, she received a letter at the restaurant. It was from a small music foundation that offered scholarships to talented individuals who couldn't afford formal training. They had seen her video and wanted to invite her for an audition. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. She read it over and over, almost afraid it might disappear if she blinked. The manager noticed her standing still near the counter. "What's wrong?" he asked. She handed him the letter. He read it and smiled wide. "This is wonderful news. You have to go for it." "I don't know," she said, shaking her head slightly. "It's been so long. I'm not sure I belong in a place like that anymore." "Listen," the manager said gently. "You've already proven you belong at that piano. Don't let fear decide for you." She thought about his words all night. When she closed her eyes, she heard her father's voice again. "One day you'll play for the world." The next morning, she decided to go. The audition was held in a quiet hall downtown. The walls were lined with framed photos of musicians and conductors. It made her nervous just walking inside. She wore her simplest clothes. Nothing fancy, just what she had. She waited for her turn, her hands cold and trembling. When they called her name, she stepped onto the small stage. A few people sat at a long table with notepads waiting. She gave a small nod and sat at the piano. For a moment, the silence was heavy. Then she began to play, the same melody that had captured everyone's hearts at the restaurant. She poured everything she had into those notes. Her years of struggle, her father's memory, her long nights of loneliness. When she finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Then one of the judges, an older man with kind eyes, said, "That was honest. Not perfect, but deeply honest." She smiled softly. "Thank you," she said. A week later, she got the call. She had been accepted into their program. Tears filled her eyes as she heard the words. For the first time in years, a door that had once closed was opening again. At the restaurant, everyone cheered for her when they heard the news. Even the guests who had once mocked her sent flowers and small notes of congratulations. The manager hugged her and said proudly, "You see, sometimes life gives us back what we thought we lost." She didn't quit her job right away. She continued to work part-time, saving money and practicing every night for her new classes. The night before her first day at the Music Foundation, she stood once again in front of the restaurant's piano after closing time. The lights were dim and the room was quiet. She sat down and played one last song, not for the guests, not for the applause, but for herself. When she finished, she looked up and smiled. For years she had felt like life had stolen her music. Now she realized it had only been waiting for her to come back. The next morning, as she walked into the music hall with her old folder of sheet music, she felt nervous, but also alive. The smell of polished wood, the soft echo of pianos from other rooms, it all felt like coming home. Her teacher, a kind woman with silver hair, greeted her warmly. "Welcome," she said. "We've been waiting for you." In the weeks that followed, her days were filled with practice, learning, and rediscovering what she once loved so deeply. It wasn't easy. She struggled with confidence, with technique, with keeping up after so many years away. But she never gave up. Every night when she came home exhausted, she would touch the old piano keys and whisper, "I'm doing it, Papa." Months passed, and she grew stronger. Her fingers moved faster, her music deeper, her confidence steadier. She played at small recitals and slowly began to rebuild a life that felt truly hers. Sometimes she still visited the restaurant on weekends to play a few songs. The guests always cheered when they saw her, and the manager treated her like family. One evening, while she was playing, she noticed a familiar face in the audience, the same man who had once mocked her the most. He wasn't laughing this time. When she finished, he walked up and said quietly, "I was wrong about you. You taught me something that night, she smiled kindly. Sometimes music speaks louder than words, she replied. As he left, she looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once served tables, now touching hearts. Her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And deep inside, she knew her father had been right all along. One day she would play for the world, and that day was getting closer. Months passed quickly, and life began to change in ways the waitress never imagined. The small music foundation she joined became more than just a place to learn. It became a place where she started to believe in herself again. Every morning she would wake up early, take a bus across town, and spend hours practicing in the quiet rooms filled with the faint scent of old wood and sheet music. At first, it felt strange to be surrounded by students who were younger, full of energy and confidence. They played fast, they talked loudly, and they all seemed so sure of their future. She often sat quietly in the corner, unsure if she truly belonged there. But when her fingers touched the piano, everything else disappeared. Her music came from a deeper place, not from ambition, but from the kind of experience that life itself teaches. Her teacher often stopped to listen outside her practice room. One afternoon, the teacher walked in and said softly, "You play with heart. That's something not everyone can learn." Those words stayed with her. Every time she felt like giving up, she remembered them. Still, it wasn't easy balancing two worlds. She continued working at the restaurant 3 evenings a week to pay her bills. The long hours, the noise, and the endless walking left her exhausted, but she never complained. She would often come home late, her feet aching, her hands sore. Yet she still sat down at her old piano to practice one more piece before sleeping. Sometimes, while playing, she would smile quietly. The same piano that once reminded her of lost dreams now felt like a friend cheering her on. At the restaurant, customers still remembered her story. People from other towns came just to hear the waitress who played from her soul. The manager treated her like family, and even the kitchen staff seemed proud whenever she performed. On her nights off, she would sometimes sneak in to listen to others play. She didn't do it to be seen. She simply loved being near the sound of live music. One night after her shift, she sat outside on a bench near the back door, untying her apron. The cook stepped out for a smoke and smiled. "You look tired," he said. She nodded. "A little. But it's a good kind of tired." He laughed softly. "You're doing something right. Everyone's talking about you again." "Did you see that magazine article?" "What article?" she asked, surprised. He handed her a small newspaper clipping folded in his pocket. It was from a local arts magazine. The headline read, "From waitress to pianist, the woman who played her way back to hope." Her eyes widened. There was a photo of her sitting at the piano in the restaurant, her hands mid-motion, her face calm and focused. The article described how her story had inspired people to chase their dreams again, no matter their age or struggles. She smiled shyly, her heart full of disbelief. "I didn't know anyone would care that much," she said quietly. "They do," the cook replied. "You gave people something real." She folded the paper carefully and put it in her bag. That night, as she walked home, she felt the wind against her face and thought about how strange life could be. A year ago, she was invisible. Now people she'd never met were finding hope in her story. But as her world grew brighter, new challenges appeared. Her lessons at the foundation became tougher. The instructors pushed her to perform more complex pieces. She had to learn new techniques, memorize pages of music, and prepare for her first live recital. At first, she was excited, but soon the pressure began to wear on her. She stayed late at the practice hall almost every night, sometimes skipping meals. Her fingers cramped from the long hours. The teacher warned her gently, "Don't lose the joy of playing. Remember, music should feel alive," she nodded. But deep down she was afraid. Afraid of failing, of letting everyone down, of proving that maybe she didn't belong among real musicians. One evening, after a long practice, she walked into her apartment and sat quietly on the floor beside the piano. The city lights blinked outside her window. She rested her head on her knees and whispered to herself, "You've come this far. Don't stop now." Her father's words echoed faintly in her mind. "One day you'll play for the world." A week later, the recital day arrived. The small concert hall was filled with students, teachers, and a few local journalists. She sat backstage, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't her first time performing in front of people, but it felt different this time. This time it mattered. When her turn came, she walked out slowly. The lights were bright and the piano shone under them like something sacred. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes were shaky, but then she found her rhythm. The melody flowed naturally, full of emotion. She didn't play perfectly, but her music had warmth and honesty. The audience listened quietly, some closing their eyes. When she finished, there was a soft silence followed by genuine applause. She smiled through the tears she had been holding back. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a waitress pretending to be a pianist. She felt like a musician. After the recital, the director of the Music Foundation approached her. "You've grown a lot in a short time," he said kindly. "Keep going. You have something rare." Those words gave her courage. The next few months became a whirlwind of new experiences. She was invited to small community events, charity concerts, and even an interview on local television. People loved hearing her story, not because she was famous, but because she was real. She spoke softly about perseverance, about never giving up on what makes your heart alive. But with the growing attention came a new kind of loneliness. She had less time for herself. Some nights she missed the quiet comfort of the restaurant kitchen, the simple routine of serving coffee, listening to laughter, and hearing the clink of glasses. One evening, she returned to the restaurant after a long day of practice. The manager was surprised but happy to see her. "I thought you were too busy now," he said with a grin. "I miss this place," she said softly. "It feels like home," he nodded. "You'll always have a place here." She spent the night playing softly in the corner, just like before. The familiar rhythm of people talking and the gentle hum of the piano brought her peace. It reminded her that success didn't mean forgetting where you started. As the night ended, an elderly couple approached her. "We came all the way from another city just to hear you," the woman said with a smile. "Your music gave us courage." "Thank you." The waitress smiled warmly and replied, "I'm the one who should thank you. I wouldn't be here without people like you." That night, as she walked home under the quiet streetlights, she realized something important. She didn't need grand stages or fame. What mattered most was that her music reached people's hearts. Still, life had one more test waiting for her. A few weeks later, she received a call from her teacher. A major city orchestra was holding open auditions for guest performers, and they wanted her to try. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of opportunity she had once dreamed about as a child, playing on a grand stage with professionals. But fear whispered in her mind again. "What if I fail? What if they laugh at me like before?" She almost turned it down. But then she remembered that first night, when the pianist had fallen sick and she had gathered the courage to step up. Back then she hadn't been ready either. Yet something beautiful had happened because she took that risk. She looked at her piano and smiled. Maybe it's time to take another leap. And so, she said yes. The next chapter of her life was about to begin, one that would test her strength, her heart, and her belief in herself all over again. As she packed her music sheets and set her alarm for early morning practice, she whispered softly, "I'm ready, Papa. I'm really doing it." The night outside was quiet. The same stars that once watched her struggle now seemed to shine a little brighter. She didn't know what awaited her at the audition, but one thing was certain. No matter where life took her, she would always carry the heart of the girl who once played in a restaurant and silenced the world with her song. And that heart was stronger than ever. The morning of the audition arrived with the kind of nervous silence that made her heart race. The city still slept as she walked toward the bus stop, holding her music folder close to her chest. The streets were empty except for the soft hum of early traffic. Her hands were cold, but her mind was full of music. She kept whispering to herself, "You've done this before. You can do it again." The ride felt endless. Every few minutes she looked out of the window, watching tall buildings pass by like ghosts. She thought of her father, the restaurant, the small piano that started it all. She remembered the night people laughed at her, and how that same night they had fallen silent when she played. That memory gave her courage. When she reached the concert hall, her breath caught. The building looked grand with glass doors and marble steps. Musicians walked in carrying cases, dressed neatly, confident and focused. She felt a small ache of doubt but forced a smile. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee. A woman at the reception handed her a tag with a number. "You're number 17, she said kindly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She found a quiet corner and opened her folder, carefully checking her sheet music. Around her, other musicians were warming up, some stretching their fingers, others whispering scales. The sound of soft notes and tuning instruments filled the air. Her teacher arrived a few minutes later, smiling proudly. "You made it," he said. "Remember, don't think about the judges. Play like you always do, with heart." She nodded. "I'll try." When her number was called, she stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment she wished she could disappear. But something inside her, maybe the same strength that helped her survive years of struggle, pushed her forward. The audition room was wide and quiet. 3 judges sat behind a long table. The piano waited in the center, shining under soft light. She bowed slightly, then sat down. Her hands hovered over the keys. The silence felt heavy, but she took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes were gentle, almost shy. But soon the melody grew stronger, filling the room with emotion. She played from memory, letting her heart guide her fingers. Each note carried her journey. The long nights, the quiet tears, the laughter she'd found again. For a few minutes the world disappeared. There was only her and the music. When she finished, she lifted her hands slowly from the piano. The room stayed silent. One of the judges leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once and said softly, "Thank you." She stood, bowed again, and walked out. Outside the room, she leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling. She didn't know if she had done well or not, only that she had given everything she had. Her teacher approached quietly. "How did it feel?" he asked. "Like I was telling my story," she said with a small smile. He smiled back. "That's exactly what great music is." She left the building feeling lighter, almost free. For the first time, she didn't care about the result. Just being there and among professional musicians sharing her truth felt like a victory. The next few days passed slowly. She went back to work at the restaurant, serving tables as usual. But something inside her had changed. She carried herself with quiet confidence now. Even when the kitchen got loud or customers were demanding, she stayed calm. She had faced something much bigger than that. A week later, while she was wiping down a table near the window, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the orchestra. Her heart skipped. She hesitated for a moment, afraid to open it. Then, taking a deep breath, she tapped the screen. The message began with polite words, but as she read further, her eyes widened. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a guest performer for our upcoming charity gala concert." Her hand flew to her mouth. She stood still, unable to speak. The restaurant around her faded, the noise, the clinking glasses, everything. The manager noticed her expression and walked over. "What's wrong?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." She looked up with teary eyes. "I got it," she whispered. "They chose me." The manager grinned widely. "You're kidding." "That's amazing." Everyone in the restaurant clapped when they heard the news. The cook came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and said, "Looks like we'll be seeing you on TV now." She laughed through her tears. Maybe just for one night. That evening, she walked home with a feeling she couldn't describe. She sat at her piano, touching the keys softly, and whispered, "We did it." The following weeks were busy. The orchestra sent her schedules, music sheets, and rehearsal times. She practiced harder than ever, balancing work, lessons, and preparation. Sometimes she stayed up past midnight, running through the same passages again and again until her fingers hurt. But she never complained. She felt alive, truly alive. The gala concert was to be held in one of the most prestigious halls in the city. Guests included artists, diplomats, and business leaders, people she once served coffee to, people who probably would never have noticed her before. When the day finally came, she stood backstage in a simple black gown, her hair tied neatly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The air buzzed with nervous excitement. The orchestra members moved around her, tuning instruments, adjusting sheets. The conductor walked up to her and said warmly, "You'll do fine. Just follow your heart." She nodded, barely able to speak. When her name was announced, she walked out under the bright lights. The audience stretched before her, hundreds of faces, some familiar, some not. She spotted a few people from the restaurant sitting near the back, cheering quietly. That made her smile. Then she turned to the piano. The hall was silent. She placed her hands gently on the keys. The first note rang clear, echoing softly through the space. Then another and another, building into a melody that told her story without words. The orchestra joined in, wrapping her music in warmth and color. It felt like the world had opened up around her. She played with all her heart, each note a memory, her struggles, her dreams, her love for music. When the final chord faded, there was a moment of stillness. Then the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood clapping, some with tears in their eyes. She blinked through her own tears, bowing deeply. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The same kind of people who once mocked her now stood in respect. Backstage, musicians and staff congratulated her. The conductor shook her hand. "That was remarkable," he said. "You didn't just play. You made everyone feel." Later that night, after all the noise and lights, she found herself standing outside the hall, holding a small bouquet of flowers someone had given her. The cool night air brushed against her face. She looked up at the sky full of stars and smiled quietly. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her teacher. It read simply, "I told you the world needed to hear you." She sat down on the steps of the hall, still in her gown, and let out a soft laugh. "I guess they did," she whispered. The next day, her story spread across social media. News outlets wrote headlines like, "From Waitress to Concert Pianist, the woman who silenced the elite." Videos of her performance went viral. People everywhere shared comments about how her courage moved them, but she didn't chase the fame. She stayed humble. She still returned to the restaurant sometimes, not because she had to, but because it reminded her of where she began. She greeted the same customers, helped the same coworkers, and occasionally played a song in the corner, just like before. Only now, when she played, the entire room listened differently. There was no laughter, no mockeries, only quiet admiration. And sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the piano lid, she saw not just a woman who had struggled, but a woman who had risen one note at a time. Her journey wasn't over yet. There was still more to learn, more music to share. But that night, the night she played for the orchestra and silenced the world, she finally understood what her father meant all those years ago. One day, you'll play for the world. And she had. The morning after the concert felt unreal. The city seemed softer somehow, the air calmer, the streets quieter, as if the world itself was pausing to breathe. She sat by her small window, holding a cup of tea, still wearing the faint trace of makeup from the night before. Her gown hung neatly over the chair, and the bouquet of flowers rested on her table. She kept replaying the performance in her mind, the lights, the music, the applause. It all felt like a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. Her phone buzzed nonstop that morning. Messages, emails, and calls from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some were old friends. Some were strangers who had seen her story online. There were interview requests, invitations to perform, and messages from students asking for advice. She smiled gently as she read through them. It was overwhelming but beautiful, yet deep inside, she still felt like the same woman who once wiped tables and refilled glasses between songs. Later that day, she decided to take a quiet walk to the park near her apartment. The trees were shedding their last golden leaves, and the air smelled of earth and autumn. She sat on a bench near the pond, watching children play and old men feed pigeons. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes after years of struggle. She closed her eyes and thought of her father again. His voice echoed softly in her memory, the way he used to encourage her, saying, "Music isn't about showing off. It's about sharing what's inside your heart." She whispered, "You were right, Papa. You always were." Over the next few months, her life changed quickly. She began receiving invitations to perform at charity events, community concerts, and even international gatherings. Every time she walked onto a stage now, people recognized her, the waitress who silenced the elite. But she never let the fame change her. She remained humble, kind, and deeply grounded. She still took the bus. She still visited the restaurant often, where her old co-workers greeted her like family. The manager would joke, "You're our star now." And she'd laugh softly, replying, "I'll always just be me." One day, while sitting at her piano, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope was elegant with a gold emblem on it. Inside was an invitation. The National Music Awards wanted to honor her with a special recognition for inspiring excellence through perseverance and talent. She read the letter twice, unable to believe it. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "For me? Really?" It wasn't about the trophy or the attention. It was about what the moment represented. Proof that her long, painful journey had meant something. Proof that even broken dreams can find a way to shine again. The award ceremony was held in a grand auditorium filled with artists, producers, and well-known musicians. As she stood backstage waiting for her name to be called, her heart raced the same way it had the first time she played at the restaurant. Some things never change. When her name echoed through the hall, she walked out under the bright lights. The applause was warm, sincere. She accepted the award with trembling hands and took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice was soft but steady. "I wasn't always a pianist," she began. "I used to serve tables, clean dishes, and dream in silence. There were nights when I wanted to give up, when I thought maybe music had left me behind. But I learned that it never really leaves you. If something is meant for your heart, it waits, patiently, until you're ready to hold it again." The audience listened in complete silence. Some smiled, some wiped away quiet tears. She continued, "I don't stand here because I'm special. I stand here because I refuse to stop believing in something that made me feel alive. And if my story means anything, I hope it reminds you. No matter who you are or where you are, your dreams are still waiting for you." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding. She bowed deeply, holding back tears. It was one of those moments when life comes full circle, when pain turns into strength, and silence turns into music. After the ceremony, she was approached by a man in his 60s wearing glasses and a warm smile. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "But I was in the audience that night at the restaurant, the night you played for the first time." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You were there?" He nodded. "Yes, I was one of the guests who, well, I'll admit I didn't treat you kindly at first. But when you started playing, I realized how wrong I was. I never forgot that night. Your music changed the way I look at people." For a moment, she was speechless. Then she smiled softly and said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." They shook hands, and as he walked away, she felt something inside her heart quietly heal. A few weeks later, she was invited to speak at a music academy for underprivileged children. The hall was filled with young faces, some shy, some curious, some full of silent hope. She told them her story, not to impress them, but to remind them that everyone starts somewhere. "Don't worry about who believes in you," she said gently. "Believe in yourself first. The rest will come." After her talk, one little girl approached her timidly and asked, "Do you think someone like me could play like you someday?" She knelt down, smiling. "You already can," she said softly. "You just have to start." The little girl hugged her tightly before running back to her seat. That hug stayed with her for days. Years passed, and her career grew steadily. She recorded albums, performed in different countries, and became known not just as a pianist, but as someone who gave back to her community. She started a small foundation that offered free music lessons to children from low-income families. It was her way of giving others the chance she once dreamed of. But even as her life blossomed, she never forgot her roots. Every year on the same date, the anniversary of the night she first played in the restaurant, she returned there quietly. The place had changed a little, new paint on the walls, new faces among the staff, but the old piano still stood in the corner. She would sit down and play softly, without any announcement or spotlight. The music would fill the room, and though most customers didn't realize who she was, a few older ones did, and they smiled knowingly. It became her own quiet tradition, a way of honoring where it all began. One of those nights, after finishing her set, she sat at the bar sipping tea. The manager, older now with grayer hair, leaned over and said, "You know that piano survived everything. It's like it's waiting for you," she smiled. "Maybe it remembers," he chuckled. "Maybe it does." They both sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the restaurant. As the night went on and the crowd thinned, she walked over to the piano one last time and pressed a single note. It rang clear and gentle. She whispered, "Thank you," as if speaking to an old friend. When she stepped outside, the city lights reflected on the wet pavement. She looked up at the sky and felt that same peace she had felt on the park bench years ago. Life had tested her, broken her, and rebuilt her. But through it all, one thing had never changed: her love for music. And now her music had become something bigger than herself. It had touched lives, healed hearts, and reminded people of hope. As she walked home that night, she passed a small group of street performers playing violins and drums. She stopped for a moment to listen. Their music was raw and imperfect, but full of life. She smiled, dropped a few bills into their open case, and said softly, "Keep playing, don't stop." They smiled back, not realizing who she was, but feeling the warmth in her words. When she reached home, she placed her award on a small shelf beside an old photograph of her father. She touched the frame gently and whispered, "We did it, Papa. We really did." The room was quiet except for the ticking clock. She sat at her piano once more, her fingers gliding over the keys. The melody she played that night wasn't for an audience. It was for herself, a song of peace, gratitude, and love. The same piano that had witnessed her struggles now echoed with victory, and as the final note faded into the air, she closed her eyes and smiled. Her journey, the waitress, the dreamer, the pianist, had come full circle. She had silenced the elite not with anger or pride, but with the language of her heart, and that music would live on quietly, beautifully, long after the applause had faded.